Today in the Daily Dose, the presidency of John F. Kennedy. In January 1961, when the newly minted president and his first lady emerged from the White House, they ushered in a new era in Washington, which would later become known as the Age of Camelot. The public's fascination with Jackie Kennedy began during the presidential campaign of 1959 and 1960, when the growing influence of televised news coverage placed Jack and Jackie in nearly every American household. While less than 20% of households owned a single television in 1950, by the beginning of the next decade, nearly 90% of American homes contained one or more TVs, elevating the first couple to role model status regarding what American families could look like. The couple's appeal extended well beyond the United States, particularly Jackie's, who became an international celebrity when she accompanied the president to Europe.
I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
Back at home, due to the broad reach of television news reporting, the Kennedys projected the image of a thriving all-American family. And while Jackie was well aware of her husband's long-standing reputation as a womanizer, even before she married him, the couple projected a squeaky clean aura with the American public. The image would hold throughout his shortened presidency and life, despite his many rumored affairs, and the fact that his entire life had been plagued by illnesses and a debilitating degenerative spinal condition, which required him to wear a back brace, along with a 6-inch wide elastic bandage wrapped around his upper legs and lower torso. Television cameras followed the first couple during their frequent escapes from the pressures of Washington, when the iconic duo invited close friends to relax near the president's Hyannisport family compound on Cape Cod. Many historians believe that John Kennedy's appeal before the American people was a combination of dashing good looks, a subtle blending of style and substance, combined with an oratory panache rarely achieved by sitting presidents before or since his administration.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
In the final months of JFK's life, the president had finally achieved what poet Robert Frost urged him to do during Kennedy's January 1961 inauguration, which was to marry poetry to power, forever cementing the days of Camelot into the fabric of American history. The television camera became JFK's ticket to national stardom, which he used to his favor in the first generation of televised politics. As for the origins of Kennedy's enduring mystique, it was Jackie Kennedy who, a week after her husband's assassination, compared their time in the White House to Camelot. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Covertly funded by the CIA, the 3-day Bay of Pigs invasion would prove to be a disaster for the Kennedy administration, going down as one of the most glaring failures in CIA history. In 1952, American ally General Fulgencio Batista led a coup against Cuban President Carlos Prio, forcing Prio to flee the island nation into exile in nearby Miami. The overthrow inspired Fidel Castro to form the 26 July movement, which would escalate into the Cuban Revolution of December 1958. Once in power, Castro nationalized all American business interests on the island, including banks, oil refineries, as well as sugar and coffee plantations, before severing previously close relations with the United States. In its place, Castro embraced relations with America's Cold War rival, the Soviet Union. In response, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower allocated $13.1 million to the CIA in March 1960 for direct use against the Castro regime. The money helped to form a Cuban exile paramilitary group called Brigade 2506, an armed wing of the Democratic Revolutionary Front whose sole objective was the overthrow of Castro's increasingly communistic-backed regime. aided by the CIA and strategic U.S. military personnel, the counter-revolutionary unit of 1,400 Cuban paramilitaries was trained in Guatemala. On April 17, 1961, the newly minted President John F. Kennedy allowed the invasion attempt to go forward. However, he stripped the mission of direct support of U.S. air and naval assets, which almost certainly doomed the invasion attempt to failure. 2 days earlier, 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers had attacked Cuban airfields, allowing the invasion force to land uncontested on a beach in Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs, where it was soon overwhelmed by local Cuban militias. Within 3 days, the invaders had been defeated and thrown into Cuban prisons. The 3-day Bay of Pigs invasion would prove to be a disaster for the Kennedy administration, going down as one of the most glaring failures in CIA history. On September 12, 1962, many historians believe that Kennedy's "Let's Go to the Moon" speech was a belated attempt to deflect attention from his mistakes during the Bay of Pigs invasion, while his inept understanding about the geopolitical importance of Cuba would go on to spawn the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the Soviet Union installed nuclear missile batteries on Cuba aimed directly at the United States, a mere 90 miles away. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, completing a suborbital flight aboard Freedom 7. His 15-minute flight would take him 150 miles up into space, where he was able to fully control the pitch, roll, and yaw of the spacecraft. Upon his return to Earth, Shepard became an instant national celebrity, flying into space a mere 3 weeks after Gagarin became the first man in space. John Glenn served as a backup pilot for Alan Shepard and Gus Grisham, who made the first 2 successful suborbital test flights in the Mercury space program. After weeks of anxious delays, on February 20, 1962, just 59 years after the Wright brothers' historic first flight, John Glenn became the first American in space when he flew his Friendship 7 space capsule to an altitude of 162 miles above Earth. Splashing down after 5 hours and 3 Earth orbits, Glenn's image as a national hero would follow him for the rest of his life. After Gagarin's successful 1961 flight, Director of Cosmonaut Training Nikolai Kamenin read in an American media source that female test pilots in the U.S. were training to become astronauts. As a result, Kamenin gained approval for an all-female cosmonaut program, which began training in 1963. Born on March 6, 1937, textile worker Valentina Tereshkova had no previous desire to fly in space. However, her love of skydiving made her an excellent candidate for the Soviet space program. Training included isolation tests, centrifuge G-force tests, thermochamber tests, decompression chamber tests, and pilot training in the MiG-15 fighter jet. On June 16, 1963, Tereshkova reached outer space in her Vostok 6 rocket after a flawless liftoff. Although she experienced nausea and physical discomfort for most of the flight, she orbited the Earth 48 times in just under 3 days, making her the first and only woman to solo in space. As was the protocol in all Vostok missions, Tereshkova ejected from her capsule during its descent at about 4 miles above the Earth, parachuting to the ground in Kazakhstan on June 19, 1963. Meanwhile, back in the United States, on September 12, 1962, President John F. Kennedy fueled the space program by delivering his now infamous speech at Rice University.
And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it.
He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
The Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War. In 1959, Fidel Castro seized control of the island nation of Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the American mainland. Shortly after the coup, Castro declared Cuba a communist nation and began forging a tight relationship with the Soviet Union. Concerned about the proliferation of communism, in April of 1961, the US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion proved to be an enormous disaster, further straining Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. In response, in 1962, the Cubans and Soviets began secretly building nuclear missile sites on Cuba, which would offer the Soviet Union an unprecedented first-strike capability against the Americans. On October 15th, U.S. intelligence personnel discovered the existence of Russian nukes on Cuba, prompting President John F. Kennedy to mandate a naval blockade against any Soviet ship approaching the island nation. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced the threat to the nation, causing widespread panic across North America. After the Soviets refused to acknowledge the existence of any missiles on Cuba, the United States began to initiate the early stages of an invasion plan. On October 25th, the Soviets challenged the blockade for the first time, eventually turning away from Cuba in the face of superior U.S. naval strength and determination. On that same day, Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, confronted the Soviets in the UN General Assembly, revealing U-2 spy plane photographs which forced the Soviets to admit that the missile bases existed. The crisis finally ended on October 28, when JFK and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement which called for the removal of Soviet missiles on Cuba in exchange for the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey, which posed an equal geographic threat to Russia and her Eastern Bloc satellites. To this day, the Cuban Missile Crisis is regarded as the closest the United States has ever come to nuclear war, as well as a defining moment in the Cold War's ongoing threat of mutually assured destruction. JFK's Ich bin ein Berliner speech. After the surrender of Germany, near the end of World War II, Berlin and the whole of Germany was divided between the Communist East and the Democratic West, causing Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to call West Berlin a bone in my throat, further vowing to eradicate this splinter from the heart of Europe. When Khrushchev later threatened to restrict Western access to West Berlin, in a televised address to the nation on July 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy pushed back at the Soviet leader's threat, announcing a major military buildup in Western-held Germany, further declaring that any attack on West Berlin would be viewed as an attack on the United States. As the Cold War reached its zenith years, less than 7 months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and an equal number of months before JFK's tragic assassination, on June 26, 1963, after the young president viewed the Berlin Wall and the barrenness of East Berlin, he rejected a script written by his speechwriters, penning his own words for an address before an enthusiastic crowd of West Berliners, a speech that would galvanize his presidency, at the same time highlighting his staunch defense of democracy and self-determination.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future, let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. For it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy. With election season fast approaching, on November 22, 1963, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy joined her husband on a 10-mile motorcade through Dallas, Texas, in a convertible Lincoln Continental limousine, waving to an enthusiastic crowd that lined the parade route. Along for the ride sat Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, when at 12:30 in the afternoon, as their limo passed the Texas School Book Depository building, 3 shots rang out from a 6th-floor window, ending the life of the 35th President of the United States and seriously wounding Governor Connally.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded.
A flash from Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas. I will repeat with the greatest regret, 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he has died of bullet wounds.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas.
For those Americans alive at the time, the tragic murder of the Commander-in-Chief gutted a nation to its core. Passing away at Parkland Hospital at the still young age of 46, at 2:39 that same afternoon, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson took the presidential oath aboard Air Force One as it sat on the runway at Dallas Love Field, in front of 30 eyewitnesses, including Jackie Kennedy, who still wore clothes stained with her dead husband's blood. 7 minutes later, Air Force One departed Dallas for its return flight to Washington, carrying with it the slain president's body. Less than an hour after JFK's murder, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald took the life of Dallas police officer J.D. Tibbet, who had stopped Oswald near the suspect's Dallas rooming house. 2 days later, while Oswald was being moved from Dallas police headquarters to a more secure location, the suspected assassin was himself slain by strip club owner Jack Ruby, which in turn laid the groundwork for years of speculation and conspiracy theories regarding who ordered the president's assassination. On November 25, 1963, a nation came together to mourn the loss of a dynamic American icon, as Kennedy's horse-drawn caisson traveled from the U.S. Capitol to a requiem mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, before leaders from 92 countries followed his caisson to Arlington National Cemetery, where he was buried with full military honors on a slope below Arlington House. At the request of his widow, Jacqueline lit an eternal flame, which still burns to this day in honor of the fallen president, making the assassination of John F. Kennedy a prescient foreshadowing of a nation's violent years to come. And there you have it, the presidency of John F. Kennedy.